What's new from Apple? There's the new iPhone 16 Pro, built for Apple Intelligence. And it comes with the all-new camera control, giving you an easier way to quickly access your camera tools. The new Apple Watch Series 10 has our biggest display and our thinnest design ever. And this? It's the sound of active noise cancellation, now available on one of 2 new AirPods 4 models. So quiet. Check out all of the new products and new features at apple.com. You can even buy yourself something new. See apple.com for product availability updates. Apple Intelligence coming this fall.
Summer's here, and you can now get almost anything you need for your sunny days delivered with Uber Eats. What do we mean by almost? Well, you can't get a well-groomed lawn delivered, but you can get a chicken parmesan delivered. A cabana? That's a no. But a banana? That's a yes. A nice tan? Sorry, nope. But a box fan? Happily, yes. A day of sunshine? No. A box of fine wines? Yes. Uber Eats can definitely get you that. Get almost anything delivered with Uber Eats. Order now. Alcohol in select markets. Product availability may vary by region. See app for details.
Thanks for listening to the Red Treehouse, where I tell scary stories to keep you up at night. You can listen to the Red Treehouse on your favorite streaming platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Oh, and leave a 5-star review. You can follow the Red Treehouse on social media, on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, X, Threads, and Facebook at Red Treehouse Pod. And now you can find the Red Treehouse on Patreon. Join the Red Treehouse community for as little as $3 per month and receive exclusive member benefits, including personal shoutouts, early access to episodes, bonus episodes, and more. Simply go to patreon.com/Red Treehouse. As always, if you have a scary story or topic you'd like me to feature on an upcoming episode, email redtreehousepod@gmail.com. Important note, sources for this episode can be found in the show notes. The Red Treehouse is dedicated to my dad. I love you, Pop. Of all the things I love to do, traveling is near the top of the list. Over the years, I've visited over 10 countries across 4 continents, and I have a few more planned for the years ahead. I love immersing myself in other cultures, the sounds, smells, faces, and food. There's just something beautiful about all of it. But I also love history, and especially haunted history. I'm always fascinated by the local haunts and spooky stuff. My wife and I are already planning a trip to Paris, and you can bet we'll tour the infamous catacombs beneath the city streets. I'm sure we'll try to visit a few more cities while we're out there, and I'll bring you a few episodes of the Red Treehouse. Among the most haunted locations in all of Europe is Edinburgh, Scotland, a place with millennia-old history and no shortage of paranormal and scary goings-on. Shout out to my in-laws who are there right now. For most of us, I've no doubt the Loch Ness Monster comes to mind when we think about Scotland. And in many ways, Nessie is Scotland's most famous haunt, and arguably the most famous cryptid out there. We will explore the strange and mysterious Loch Ness Monster in an upcoming episode of the Red Treehouse. In this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're going to explore one of Scotland's most famous haunted locations, the Edinburgh Vaults. What scary phenomena lies just beneath the surface of one of Scotland's most famous landmarks? I'll share the details. You decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse. Consistently ranked among the 10 best places to live in Europe, Scotland is a land with a rich history. A huge part of the United Kingdom, it accounts for nearly 1/3 of the total land area of the UK. Scotland sits on the northern part of the island of Great Britain. Nearly 6 million people live in the area, with just shy of 20% living in Scotland's two largest cities, Glasgow and Edinburgh. Scotland's history dates back millennia, with the earliest written reference in 320 BC by Greek sailor Pytheas, who referenced the Orkney Islands on the northern tip. Much of Scotland's history includes war, uprisings, and rebellions. So its reputation as one of Europe's most haunted countries makes good sense. One article stated, quote, "Scotland has always been a divided nation, and its history is splattered with the blood of countless conflicts. Many of them fought between the Highlanders and the Lowlanders. Only very occasionally did the two sink their differences to unite against a common enemy, as successive English kings strove to invade and conquer." End quote. Scotland is home to over 1,500 castles, and according to the National Trust for Scotland, over 20 of those are considered haunted, with perhaps none more haunted than the famous Edinburgh Castle. We will cover the haunting at Edinburgh Castle in an upcoming episode of the Red Treehouse, as it is worthy of a deep dive. In the late 18th century, Edinburgh was a growing and thriving city. To accommodate the growth and contribute to further expansion, two bridges, the North Bridge and the South Bridge, were built. The South Bridge was an engineering marvel for its time and is a 19-arch viaduct, although only one viaduct can be seen today. The remaining arches, quote, were enclosed behind tenement buildings to allow the area to serve as a commercial district. The hidden arches of the bridge were then given extra floors to allow their use for industry. In total, there are approximately 120 rooms, or vaults, beneath the surface of the South Bridge, ranging in size from 2 meters to 40 meters squared. End quote. As the South Bridge neared completion in 1788, it was determined that the bridge's oldest resident, a judge's wife, should be the first to cross. However, a few days before she was set to cross, she died. Rather than adjusting their plans, those in charge felt obligated to honor the original agreement, so she became the first to cross the South Bridge in a coffin. The locals were mortified by this, as they now believed the South Bridge to be cursed. For years, many refused to cross the bridge, instead walking through the deep valley. But why the superstition? At the onset, the vaults were intended as short-term storage and workshops for business owners. But construction on the South Bridge was rushed, and the vaults were not sealed properly, resulting in significant flooding. Less than a decade later, in 1795, the vaults were abandoned, and shortly after, they became housing for the city's poor. It's important to note, these living conditions were terrible. The vaults were damp, dark, and small. There was poor air circulation, no running water, no sanitation, and no sunlight. The small vaults housed families with as many as 10 people, leading to cramped, unsanitary conditions. As if that weren't terrible enough, crime, including robbery and murder, plagued the vaults. Mortality rates in the vaults were incredibly high, as the unsanitary conditions caused illness. And there was something else. The vaults also housed the corpses of those who died, contributing to the rancid conditions. One article stated, quote, "Towards the end of the 18th century, the vaults became home to numerous taverns, merchants, and anybody who wanted to fly under the radar of law enforcement. It is said that serial killers Burke and Hare used the vaults to stash bodies during the height of their dastardly deeds." End quote. You heard that right. The Edinburgh Vaults not only housed the poorest of the poor, but also were a place where criminals paid for fresh corpses. And by all accounts, it was a profitable business. The cool dampness of the vaults was ideal for storing corpses. And since they were close to a cemetery and a medical school, it was an ideal situation for the less savory individuals in society. For Edinburgh's poor, though, falling victim to a body snatcher was among the worst fates imaginable. As the decades passed, the conditions inside the vaults became increasingly uninhabitable, and by the 1860s, they were mostly cleared out, with the chambers then being filled with rubble and stone to prevent squatting and flooding. During World War II, they were used as air raid shelters, but after the war ended, they were forgotten once again. Until 1980, when rugby player Norrie Rowan discovered the vaults by accident. Over the next decade, Norrie and his son Norman removed hundreds of tons of rubble from the vaults by hand. Ensuing years have seen the vaults transformed into nightclubs, theaters, and more. And since 1996, Mercat Tours has organized ghost walks throughout the vaults. But what makes the Edinburgh Vaults haunted? Aside from their appearance, the vaults look like they could be haunted. Visitors have claimed to see a variety of ghostly apparitions, including one known as the Aristocrat. One article described him as, quote, "a tall man with a top hat and a beard. He's often seen in the double height room, but is also known to move into the tavern room. Dogs dislike this room. They bark, whimper, or simply refuse to enter." End quote. Something interesting. The double height room looks like it is two rooms stacked on top of each other. It is believed the room has a high ceiling due to a collapsing upper floor. Other ghostly figures have appeared in the double height room, including, quote, "a bird-like apparition that likes to swoop down, clawing at people," end quote, and, quote, "the ghost of a naked man has been seen floating in the upstairs section of the room, close to the doorway," end quote. Others have reported dramatic changes in room temperature, feeling like they're being watched, and an atmosphere described as menacing. Something interesting. The Aristocrat has been seen in the tavern room, and mediums who have tried to contact him believe his name to be Finian or Geraint Mackenzie. He is believed to have been a member of the Hellfire Club, and is thought to have ties to Satan himself. One article described the atmosphere and experiences in the tavern room, stating, quote, "People have seen a black mass moving along the ceiling, as well as the apparition of a dark figure that paces along around the room. Sighs and screams are known to come from this room, and some people claim to have felt as if they were drunk here. Some even appear to be drunk. They're unable to walk straight and suffer from extreme giggling," end quote. Perhaps the most famous ghost in the Edinburgh Vaults is known as the Watcher. Those who have claimed to see him describe him as, quote, a tall, imposing man, wearing a dirty blue coat and heavy, worn-out leather boots, end quote. It appears he does not enjoy having people in the vaults, as he is often seen glaring at tourists from a doorway, pacing the tunnels, and in some instances, growling the words, "Get out." Some visitors have reported finding scratch marks on their body after completing a tour of the vaults. The identity of the Watcher is unknown, though some speculate he may have been a criminal, or even a grave robber and body snatcher. It is unlikely his identity will ever truly be known. But as tours of the Edinburgh Vaults continue, so too will the scary encounters. Here are 3 of the scariest. Our first scary experience in the Edinburgh Vaults comes from Reddit user Read Write Laugh. Quote, "This happened years ago, October or November 2011, when I was living in London and working as a study abroad advisor for American college students. This story has been on my mind a lot recently. Every semester at the program I worked at, there's an optional trip to Scotland that starts and ends with a night in Edinburgh. And there's a tour of the Highlands in between. A couple of the students wanted to do the walking tour of the haunted vaults. I told the students when to meet outside of the hostel if they wanted to join, and were surprised when nearly every single one of them came down. It was around 30 or 40 altogether. Most of the tour was interesting because of the history, but I thought the ghost stories and haunted aspect of it were pretty gimmicky, as the tour guide took us through 3 of the underground vaults. But the students were having fun, and I was just glad they weren't getting too drunk at the hostel and embarrassing me, so I was happy. The guide started talking about this entity that lives in the 3rd vault. No one really knows what this thing looks like. There are lots of reported ghost sightings, but the entity is different. Only that there are several stories of people leaving the vault and finding scratches on their bodies. 2 Canadian tourists apparently left the vault covered in scratches, and there are a handful of other stories. And then, one creepy story the guide told us was that a woman took her younger daughter on the tour, and when the flashlight went out in the 3rd vault, the mother realized the daughter had moved all the way across the room, and the daughter said someone with 3 fingers grabbed her hand and walked her there. When I was there with the students and other tourists, the vault was super cold, and the guide's flashlight went out. It was spooky because that's a spooky-ass setting, but again, I thought it was sort of a cheesy tourist trap. We finished the tour and I went back to my room to Skype with my stepdad, a history professor, about all of the cool things I'd seen. After our call, I went to change into my PJs, and as I took my pants off, I noticed 3 long, perfectly straight scratches that basically wrapped from just above my knee, up my thigh, and around towards my butt. They looked like cat or kitten scratches. I hadn't felt a single damn thing while I was on that tour. It scared the shit out of me naturally. I called my best friend in London and made her get on Skype to see them. And then I went down to where the students were hanging out and asked a couple of the girls I'd become close to come look in the bathroom. I felt like I was going crazy. A couple of them saw the scratches and were like, "Nope, I am out of here." A little bit later, one of the male students came up to me and was like, "Hey, me too." He had 3 scratches behind one of his ears. End quote. Our second scary experience comes from Reddit user 12RushTT. Quote, "Back in 2009, my family took a trip to Edinburgh during the summer holidays. We decided to go on an Edinburgh Vaults ghost tour on one of the nights we were there. To give a bit of a backstory, it was me, who was 7 at the time, my 2 older brothers, my mom, and my dad. My dad, a retired policeman, is probably one of the biggest skeptics you will ever come across. And the idea of anything ghostly or related to ghosts, he just laughed his ass off as nonsense. The Edinburgh Vaults are an underground maze of old vaults dating back to the late 1700s. They were made as a solution to the overpopulated city at the time. The poor lived in these vaults as they had no other option. A lot of people fell ill here and died due to the damp, wet conditions. As the tour began, we descended down into the vaults. We began with taking pictures and seeing if we could find any orbs. Nothing too out of the ordinary for the first half of the tour. The group, about 12 of us, gathered into the room named Mr. Boots' room, which is said to be haunted by a dark, malevolent spirit. This is where it gets a bit weird. My dad distinctly remembers smelling one of the most foul smells he has ever come across in his life. He said it came to him in only one inhale, and then it was gone. He even remembers his nose burning from this ghastly smell that only lingered for a few moments. Not one other person in the room encountered this smell other than my dad. Keep in mind, this vault was very small, with very low ceilings. After the tour, we went back to the hotel room. As we were all getting ready for bed, my dad remembered feeling a burning sensation on his back. I remember my mom saying, "Oh my God, what happened to your back?" My dad's back was covered with 3 distinct scratches, like a claw mark of 3 fingers. The scratches were about 8 inches long. We were all pretty alarmed as to what could have done this. By morning, though, the scratches were gone. Does anyone think this was a demonic encounter? End quote. Our final scary encounter comes from Reddit user Vertigo Saint 90. Quote, "Okay, this will be a long post, but I hope people will stick with it and give me their honest feedback. I've been considering posting to this subreddit for a while now, but I'm really rubbish at using Reddit. I want to tell people about my encounter with a somewhat notorious ghost, and how to this day, I can't explain what happened to me. Back in 2019, I attended the Edinburgh Film Festival, and it was my first time visiting the city. I had an amazing time. And one night, I decided to take some time off watching films to do some tourist-like activities. In the hostel where I was staying, I saw a leaflet for the Edinburgh Vaults tour, which I thought would be fascinating, as I'm a serious history buff. If you don't know what the Edinburgh Vaults are, they are a series of chambers formed in the 19 arches of the South Bridge in Edinburgh, Scotland, which were used to house a number of different businesses until they became a shelter for the homeless. The tour was a ghost tour of the seedy part of Old Town in Edinburgh. And despite having some slightly paranormal experiences in the past, I felt pretty confident that I could handle going on my own. The first part of the tour took place above ground, and to be honest, it wasn't particularly great, as it was in the middle of June, and despite being around 6 to 7 p.m., it was sunny and bright, which really didn't create the right atmosphere. The tour guide led us to the entrance of the vaults, which we entered through a normal building, and down a flight of stairs. Before we went into the vaults, she told us to make sure our shoelaces were tied. I double-tied my laces as I didn't want to trip up as the floor was very uneven. This was where the tour really started to get interesting. The guide told us about the history of the place and the ghosts that apparently reside there. One is Mr. Boots, also known as the Watcher, who is an evil spirit who can be heard stomping around in boots. The other is a small boy that attaches itself to women he considers to be a motherly figure. He likes to grab their hand and is known to untie shoelaces. The unnamed boy is apparently scared of Mr. Boots. As a tour group, we walked from room to room as the tour guide recounted different stories of ghostly encounters. We entered one room where there used to be a fireplace, which the guide was in front of. In the archway, there was a couple, and I was standing next to them facing the guide and the couple. I decided to take a photo of the guide, when suddenly, behind the couple, I see this man. I've never seen a face full of so much hate and evil in all my life. I can't even find the words to describe how menacing they looked. The face totally looked twisted with hate. The man looked human, and he was a tall figure, wearing a long black coat or a cloak, wearing a top hat. The man had pale white skin, and he wasn't completely transparent, but was somewhat solid. The moment I saw him, the entire left side of my body went numb and cold. And I mean cold, as if that side of my body had frozen. I felt something yank at my left hand, and I pulled my eyes away from the figure in the archway to look down at the left-hand side of my body. There's nothing next to me, no one pulling on my hand. And when I looked up, Mr. Boots was gone. The guide started to move everyone to the next room, and I seriously didn't want to walk through the archway, but I know I couldn't stay in the small room any longer. I went to move when I looked down at my left shoe and noticed that the shoelace was undone. Only it's not just undone. The shoelace looked like it had been wrapped around someone's finger, and they had piled it on top of my shoe. I couldn't help but gasp out loud and called the guide over. She looked at it baffled and said she's never seen that happen to anyone before. I don't know why, but I was too scared to tell her about seeing Mr. Boots, because I felt like I couldn't tell her, like I would somehow get into trouble. I felt like I was suddenly back to being a little kid. I wasn't the only person in the tour group to have a paranormal experience. There was this big bodybuilder type who clearly thought the whole tour was just nonsense. He stood in a corner of this room, next to a wall, just minding his own business, when suddenly, he jumped and looked behind him. Apparently, he heard someone clap in his ear, except when he turned around, there wasn't anyone behind him, and no one in the group had clapped. I'm nearly at the end of this story, so thank you for sticking with me so far. The last bit is what happened to me back at the hostel when I returned from the tour. I had been sharing a room with a few other girls, and I was retelling my experience, minus seeing Mr. Boots because I thought no one would believe me. The girls thought the tour sounded really interesting, and we chatted for a bit about Scotland in general before I decided to go to sleep. As I was lying in my bunk, which was on the bottom, I was suddenly overcome by that feeling of being frozen and paralyzed, like I had experienced back in the vault. My eyes were half open, and I could see the two girls still talking on a bed. I remember wanting to call out to them, but I couldn't. I don't know how long I was stuck like this, but eventually I found that I could open my eyes fully, and I could move again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. If people are interested in some context, I have always had strange experiences on the left-hand side of my body. What I mean by this is that whenever anything paranormal happens, I feel a shiver go down the entire left-hand side of my body. You know, that feeling you get when someone walks over your grave. Well, that's what I feel. When I was 3, I was involved in a terrible accident where my dress caught on fire and I was badly burned. The part of my body most affected? The left-hand side. End quote. I'll admit, I'm a firm believer in ghosts and hauntings. Of course, I don't have definitive scientific proof of the supernatural, but the world and universe just seem too big to limit. And considering the morbid history of the Edinburgh Vaults, it's not too far of a stretch to assume something strange is going on there. And for me, the consistencies in the stories seems to matter a whole lot. It's always fascinating when some of the most picturesque locations and landmarks hold some of the darkest secrets. And coupled with Scotland's famous weather, which can go from sunny and beautiful to torrential and treacherous in a matter of minutes, you have the perfect recipe for the spooky and macabre. As we close this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're left with these lingering questions. Are the Edinburgh Vaults really haunted? And what scary phenomena lies just beneath the surface of one of Scotland's most famous landmarks? I've shared the details. Now you decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.